Hey everyone, JP here from the Biz Dojo. Just want to let you know about Newsly. It's an audio app for iOS and Android. It picks up web articles about some of the most trending topics, and then it reads them to you in a natural human voice. For the first time in the history of the internet, the web is listenable. You can browse articles from topics you choose and start playing. So stop scrolling, just start listening. Download Newsly from newsly.me.
This episode is powered by Airdrie DQ Grill and Chill, owned and operated by local entrepreneurs. Check out one of their 3 Airdrie locations today and pick up a blizzard, ice cream cake, or dilly bar. The Biz Dojo is also brought to you by Beyond a Beaten Path. If you're on the lookout for a personalized gift, head to beyondabeatenpath.ca and get started on your custom creation. Beyond a Beaten Path. Personalize it, because everything else is boring.
So it's come to my attention, JP, that everything ends.
Eventually. I mean, even the sun's going to burn out one day.
I wasn't expecting to go that deep, but that is a thing lingering over humanity at this point.
Yeah. It's a little ways away.
Hopefully.
You started out at the edge of the pool and I started out in the deep end.
You went all in.
Come in, the water's warm. We're good.
Reminds me of the time that my wife, we used to have a kitten, and I was not expecting to tell this story, but
but we're in the deep end now. Let's do it.
His name was Spartan, and her family had a pool. And she comes home one day and she's like, "Oh, I took Spartan swimming and he loved it." And I'm like, "Oh, that's cool." And so the next time we went out there, I took Spartan. I'm like, "Oh, so you like swimming, eh?" And I just chucked him into the deep end. Came to find out we had different definitions of the cat went swimming.
Emergency dive into the pool.
So she had just like dipped him in the pool, in the shallow end. And I just right off the deep end. He didn't like me much after that moment, funny enough.
That's a great story.
This is a great story. But his, back to the matter at hand, which is that everything ends. And I think, we're going to get into it in this episode with Jeremy, but I have come to appreciate the ending of things to some degree. And sort of celebrating it. And I know even just within the Biz Dojo, it's kind of taken on a life of its own in terms of the podcast component, but we have tried, and I don't want to say failed because I don't feel like failure is the right word, but we've ended quite a few different components of the show, for a multitude of reasons. And I think there's kind of a beauty to it. I don't know.
Yeah. I mean, for a little context for the listeners, like we are going to talk about loss and grief in this episode. Jeremy is a funeral director, but is someone who talks about loss and grief in all aspects of life. And as Seth and I were getting ready for the show, we were talking about some of the loss that we have had and grief that we have had with even just this show. Like it happens everywhere in life. And it is beautiful when you have the opportunity to look at it as a positive thing. Sometimes, depending on the level of loss and whatnot, it can be a little too much to take that way at the start. I think
it's a process though, right? Like,
yeah,
I'm just thinking through, chopping it up as an example, or even, maybe the blog that I was doing. I did, a blog all summer on LinkedIn every Friday morning. And I would get excited. Oh, it's Friday morning. I'm going to do my blog and, put it out there and
I know you got excited because I would get text message. Hey, it's Friday morning. I'm going to do my blog.
Yeah. And I would be just vibing on different topics and stuff. And then it just reached a point where I was like, you know what? This is over. This is done. And it was great. And I learned a lot and I'm glad I did it. But it was time to reinvest that energy elsewhere. And what was born out of that is now my daily podcast, which I'm going to say is consuming slightly more energy But I think you can say the same for Chopping It Up. That's another part of the show that we loved and we curated and created.
And we talk about it still like all the time. We're like, yeah, you know, we cut it from the show so that we could provide.
And the podium even.
Yeah. Because we originally in season 1, we had it Chopping It Up kind of as a part of the show. And we cut it, and we had the podium and we cut it. And we talk about it fondly, like all the time. We remember it. But I remember when we first said we were taking it out, I was like, oh man, I like
that.
I really like that. Like that's some of the funnest times that I have had. Some of the most ridiculous rankings I have done of things I would never normally rank.
And it doesn't have to be done forever, I guess in this instance at least. And it's not to compare, you know, our silly little show with losing a human being per se. They are very, very different. But when you can recognize the process and you see it playing out sort of all the time, does that help you when you do get to that situation where you do lose someone that's close to you, or you do go through a traumatic event and you've built up those coping mechanisms and you recognize it as you're going through it?
I had never thought about that whole cycle happening at work until we talked to Jeremy in this episode. And it's really opened my mind up to some new thoughts about what am I actually experiencing when something does happen to me? Like if I'm working on something that, you know, gets handed off to somebody else or that doesn't go well, but I was really hoping it went well. I experience all those same emotions, again, probably to a lesser degree in most instances. But I would say it's very similar. And, you know, before I experienced my first loss of a human in my life, I did actually lose a puppy. And that experience helped me prepare in the same way that I think now understanding these mini experiences is helping me prepare for when they happen and how to deal with it.
And I think that's the key. And we talk about that all the time, is the awareness when it's happening, so that, you know, you can replicate it in the future when you do need it. And, you know, maybe something to ponder heading into this episode is, you know, can you think of, maybe we'll call it a micro loss, or, you know, a moment in the last couple of weeks where, you know, something ended or you moved on from something and it was okay and you got through it, and what you learned. Welcome to the Biz Dojo with Seth and JP. This week, we are joined by Jeremy Allen. Jeremy, welcome to the dojo.
Well, thank you for having me.
So, Jeremy, you and I go way, way, way back, 20 years or so, to when I moved to Wainwright, and our paths crossed. And we were just talking about a funny, I don't know, it's not that funny actually, but I used to live all the way across town from you. And for those of you who don't know, Wainwright's a pretty small town, and you used to drive all the way across town.
We were both blocks away.
Yeah, I was both blocks away, and you would drive over and pick me up for school until the day that you crashed your car, and then I had to walk henceforth from that moment.
Yeah, it was a real pivotal moment in our friendship. But Seth and I ended up getting connected late in our...
Well, grade 12. That's when I moved.
Yeah, Yeah, and so, you know, it wasn't this lifelong experience, but we seemingly really made up for that in a short amount of time. And, you know, I'll take a step back. So for those of you that don't know who I am, my name is Jeremy Allen. And, you know, the role that I guess I play in this world that we're all trying to live in is I'm a funeral director and embalmer. And along with my wife, Bailey, we own a funeral home in a small town called Provost, Alberta. And so for me, I'm the same age as Seth. I'm just turned 36 this year, and have really ultimately been a funeral director for the entirety of my adult life. And it's the unusual part of that story is that I'm a first generation funeral director, which just simply means this wasn't a family business. It wasn't something I grew up thinking I was going to do. Just through some experiences, circumstances, some failures is what ended up actually leading me to this opportunity. Because if you knew me growing up, probably very unlikely you would have guessed this is the world that I would have maybe found my calling in. I remember being 16, 17 years old in grade 11 and 12 and being handed these sheets and being, you know, like you check off all the marks and they try to give you an idea of maybe what a good fit for you would be career-wise in the world. And ultimately what it came down to for me was like possibly, like an educator, or joking about how I hate school. So becoming a teacher didn't make a lot of sense. And I drink and swear too much to be a youth pastor. So that wasn't a really viable outcome either. But what's really unique now, and what I really love about whatever higher power people choose to believe in, like whether it's the universe, whether it's God, whatever, it doesn't matter to me what people call it. So when I think of like just the way that the universe takes care of us, if we believe in the process, what's really neat is I landed in this space of teaching people, and one of the biggest demographics that I spend time with and teach are kids and youth. So it's just like this really incredible space that I don't think I ever could have imagined being a part of, and it becoming as meaningful as it did, because it's serving two things that I desired to do 20 years ago when I was being asked what I wanted to do for the rest of my life. It's just happening in such a different way, than could be plotted out on a chart.
It's like the universe aligned for you and it brought together all the things. But how did you get there? Like, was it just you woke up one morning and you're like, universe is aligned, I know what I'm going to do? Or awesome. Like, what was the path?
Yeah, I'm glad you asked. So this is one of the neat parts, and actually like what I really love about being able to share this story here with you and with Seth is actually a really big part of why I ended up where I did. So circling back to grade 12, and at the root of this, you heard me talk about my discomfort or dislike for school settings. I actually got caught cheating on my social 30 diploma off of Seth.
I would have highly advised to cheat off someone much more.
Yeah. Well, so there's actually a few funny parts to this. So the first, the cheating itself, listen, if there's any younger people that are tuned into this broadcast, I would not recommend, taking that path.
Cheating on a diploma exam.
On a test that's worth 50% of your mark. And later I found out, like, worst case scenario out of that was going to be like wiping all of my courses from my grade 12 year and not being able to restart until the following year, which would have meant like not graduating till 05 instead of 03. So turns out risk versus reward, it wasn't a great choice. But anyway, so I remember going through that, and I remember like the moment of being caught. Didn't get caught during the test. It was an after thing. I don't know if you remember this at all, but it was like a couple days after.
I do.
And honestly, I feel like one of my superpowers is I've done an incredible amount of stupid shit in my life, but I'm actually really good at being held accountable to mess up. I'm willing to do dumb shit. But if I get caught, I'm also willing to own it, right? Looking back at that experience, I remember, it being presented to me that they thought you and I had cheated together on this thing. And I just remember my initial reaction was denial, like, no, we didn't do anything. And then it was like, I folded like a cheap suit about 2 minutes into the conversation. No, this was me. This was my decision. And which was true. Like, this wasn't a manipulation of the story. I was completely responsible for what had happened. And so I feel like there wouldn't have been long-term issues for you with that, was there? Like, did you get in big shit over that?
I don't think so. You know what moment I remember of all things? I remember meeting you somewhere, and it was like a sunny day, and then it started raining, and it was like raining in the sun. And I don't know why, but I was listening to Bubba Sparks, like the Deliverance album. And I could just like picture you. I feel like you're crying and it's raining, but it's still sunny.
Oh, yeah.
Anyway, it's this moment that's like permanently etched in my brain.
Yeah. So with a lovely letter of apology, took my ownership right away, was offered the opportunity to rewrite the test and had to do that in Edmonton. So this is summer 2003. And this does all tie back to your question, JP, I promise. So it's like now we're in Edmonton, summer 2003. I rewrite this social test. Which is funny. I ended up doing way better on. And we're driving home from that test. And my mom and dad were just like, so your aunt works at a funeral home in Calgary and they're looking for help. We think you should apply. I was like, I've absolutely not. Like, I have no desire to move to Calgary or work at a funeral home. And they're just like actually, like, we're going to Calgary. You're going to go and interview for this job because we
You've
think
already
you need
applied.
we think you need a change of scenery, right? And so like that was like how I ended up in funeral service. Like basically, not like it wasn't like went from the test to Calgary, but ended up in Calgary interviewing with the owner of the funeral home there. And like this was like a big funeral home. It still is. Like they do around they serve, I would say, approximately 3,500 families a year. So like, big time. And I remember, sitting down with the owner of this and like basically just turned 18. He has my high school transcript at this point in time. He has my driver's abstract. Like, I mean, those two things were not working in my favor.
Just a quick question on that. Were you wearing your puka shells to the interview, or
I definitely, I don't know. I think I probably had those off, but definitely my highlights were still like in full force.
Okay, good.
Yeah, guaranteed. And I looked like a knockoff of the lead singer of Rascal Flatts is what it looked like. And
I was thinking more like those guys from B44 or whatever that boy band was.
So that was like, this is summer 2003. And I ended up working at the funeral home there for about a year. And after about a year, just kind of mostly honestly got homesick. Like I hadn't been the one to make the decision to do that. So I remember giving my resignation to Ernie Hagel, is this guy's name. Really, really wonderful guy. Like I have an incredible amount of respect for the opportunity he gave me. Because I don't know, back at that thinking now, it's like if I had an 18-year-old sitting at my desk with the paperwork that I was able to provide him with, he definitely took a chance on me. And, but I remember sitting with him and just saying, you know what, Ernie, like, thank you for this opportunity, but I don't think this is for me. I'm going to move home and try out some stuff and go down a different path. But I just know this isn't for me anymore. And he's like, well, I will accept your resignation. But he said, I don't agree with you. He said, I think this is for you. Maybe you don't see it yet, and that's okay. But I do think you're going to be back one day. And I'll never forget that moment because I was 18 and it's like, yeah, what do you know, right? Like, what do you know, this guy that's been in the business forever and really was in tune with it. But so left that ultimately, try to condense it based on time, but that ultimately led to me like moving back to Wainwright, pursuing the Wainwright dream, which was bartending at Wuzzy's. So bartended at Wuzzy's for a little while, went back to Edmonton because every time I ended up in these like stagnant parts of my life. Again, remember, I'm only 19 at this point. It's not like I'm 47 years old. But every time I ended up at a stagnant time in my life, my parents were just a part of a generation where, oh, what are you going to do for the rest of your life? Right? Like we can't just have you bartending for 3 months and having life experiences. What are you going to do? So I remember it was like within about 4 weeks of being home, I was signed up to take my Bachelor of Commerce at MacEwan. So bartended from that in between time from then until school started. So September of that year, went to MacEwan. Going back to my story about not liking school. So I dropped out of 4 classes, failed my first semester, then just dropped right out of the program. Back to Wainwright, rejoined another Wainwright dream, which was the oil field. The thing is like, I'm not built for physical labor. I bruise like a peach. I hate being cold.
Yeah,
like there's a lot
4
of reasons.
4'8". Yeah.
Yeah. Like I've got these little hobbit hands, it wasn't a good fit. And which became obvious because I ended up having an oil field accident and broke my leg really badly. Like I had a 1,200 pound piece of pipe kind of roll off the rack and just about crushed me. Ended up bouncing off my chest and pinning my leg and breaking my right leg literally in half. And this is up by GP. And this would have been 2005, summer of 2005. And because, and the reason I remember this is, so I had the surgery up in GP. My parents came to my rescue. They had to get me back to Wainwright after I had this wreck. And this is like August of 2005. And it's like, so now we have this 8-hour drive back home, literally right after I broke my leg, to talk about what was I going to do for the rest of my life. And so it's just like, well, I don't like school. I think we figured that out.
We've established this at this point.
Yeah. It would make an incredible amount of sense to re-enter the oil field because that was a terrible experience. So the only other thing I'd really done up until that point in time was worked at a funeral home. And that was it was absolutely the thing that I had enjoyed the most out of the spaces that I had worked in. And so it was just like, that was basically shortly after getting home, quickly got a hold of the Canadian College of Funeral Services, which is where I went to school, and was able to enroll. And they made an exception for me to do my first semester online, which in 2005 was quite a bit bigger deal than it is now.
You had to dial up. You had to wait for stuff to download.
So yeah, kids these days, they have no idea what we would have went through. So yeah, I did my first 6 months online until I was recovered from that accident, then moved back into Edmonton and started, physically working back in the space of funeral service again, and I've been with it ever since. And what I'm learning, even now, even after, earlier, I think the recording wasn't quite going yet, but we were just talking about the spectrum of time, right? And how time is a commodity. And I look at the commodity of time and how much time I've invested into becoming the funeral director and that I desired to become. There is an incredible amount of knowledge to be gained in grief. Grief is an environment that it's such an even playing field, because until you experience loss at a very high level, it's impossible to know what it feels like. And so I've spent my entire adult life very in tune with that. I didn't used to have the words for it when I was younger. Mm-hmm. And, ultimately, Seth, like going back to your question about like this being a good space for me to have landed, based on my skill set. The words that I have now to be able to answer that with such confidence is what I've learned. And even I think going back to like when you and I became friends and why I was, why I'm able to have such meaningful relationship in such a short period of time is because I believe I'm extremely emotionally intelligent. And so having that emotional intelligence and being able to move into this space of grief and loss and walking alongside families during arguably the hardest experiences of loss, I think it's just served me really well. And it's actually put me in a position to serve people very well, because empathy for me is something that I understand at a very high level. And I've practicing, I know that sounds funny, but I've practicing empathy for my entire adult life. And a lot of people will never have that opportunity to do that, right? So it's just such a meaningful space to have had the opportunity to become a part of. And I love that it's not like this Cinderella story, right? Like, I mean, it is at the very root of this was literally me getting caught cheating on a social diploma in my grade 12 year. Like that was the catalyst for change that ended up, starting me down a path that eventually stuck to me finding the thing that I believe I was meant to do in this world.
It is, it's a trip, because as you were walking through that story, I can think of like several points where our paths crossed up in Edmonton. I didn't like school either. My experience of going to MacEwan, we're not going to get into the details, but I would have been better off just taking a pile of money and lighting it on fire on the lawn than what occurred in that year. But I mean, while, we're getting into it here on the topic of death, and, I guess you were only a couple of years into it. It seems weird now, because even at the time, it seemed like you were already so in tune with this space. But like when my dad died, hands down, the worst day of my life, worst year, like, and you said like, you don't know how to deal with that until you deal with that. But I just remember one of the first people to reach out the day it happened was you, and just how like warm and compassionate and caring you were. And like, it made an impact. Like I can still feel it 15 years later.
I think grief is just have the opportunity to show up very intentionally. And again, like these are words I'm learning from being involved in the settings that I'm in over the course of my lifetime. But like going back to when Chris died, man, it's for me, like you talk, first of all, I want to address that feeling like that, like how when you end up in those settings and oftentimes you remember the people, and Maya Angelou talks about, I'm going to probably do a terrible job of quoting her, but it's along the lines of, very seldomly do people remember what you said, but always they remember how you made them feel. And my thing is in those moments, and I can talk about this much more clearly now than I could have when we were kids, when your dad died. But the reality is it doesn't matter what you say. I'm an emotional guy. This is not new to you, but I think the only thing that mattered in that moment was I just needed you to know how sorry I was that your dad died. And even though it's 18 years later, I'm still sorry your dad died. And I think, the thing that I'm so passionate about now and wanting to have these conversations, really like get on the mountaintops and tell the world about is like, I'm not apologetic about the emotion I have attached to grief, because it's a very meaningful space. It's a very, it's like this really elusive space that very few people will probably ever properly experience. And the thing is like, when you talk about your dad, and I go back to thinking about what it just felt like to be your friend in those moments, those aren't the parts of grief I want to forget about. Like, that's not the thing I'm trying to rush through. And so the thing that I'm learning, and the more articulated we become about talking about grief and talking about loss, it doesn't remove the emotion from the experience, but it removes the fear. The thing that I want people to know is like, you're going to be extremely intimidated about the idea of calling you care about whose dad's died, because there's nothing natural about that conversation. But I can guarantee you the worst thing that can happen is if you say nothing at all. And what I've learned at such a high level is just that, like, even now again, like, thinking to however many years later since Chris passed away, I'm even how this conversation is going. Like, I'm saying his name purposefully. I want to talk about your dad. I want to say his name. I want to enter into that space, because what I want you to know is just that, like, his presence continues in such a different way than it was supposed to. Your dad is extremely present in this conversation. And, it's incredible to me that how we could reverse engineer this and be able to figure out how much a part of this he is. The thing that I'm a big fan of is saying their name, and oftentimes what I've learned again is people really hesitate, to talk about it. They hesitate to say their name. They hesitate to bring it up because they think, well, what if I say Chris's name and you get emotional? Now I've just reminded you that your dad died. And again, like, whether this is within the first week, month, year, 15 years, timeline almost doesn't matter to me when it comes to that. Because what I've learned again about that is when we talk about your dad, when I say his name, there's nobody more aware of his missing presence than you and your siblings. Not once am I able to remind you that your dad died, because there's nobody more aware of that than you. But when we talk about him, it reminds you that he lived. And I think it creates a safety for you to have way more confidence to bring your dad up in conversation, that this is a safe place. And, like, the thing about grief is, yeah, of course, sadness is a huge part of the emotion of grief, but so is joy. And it doesn't take long for me to transition this sad emotion and these tears into laughter when I think about how inappropriate your dad was, making jokes and drinking beer and watching football and doing these things and, in the presence of these 17-year-old kids. And I loved it because he just treated us like people.
Kid Rock.
You're right. And I am in love with grief, because it is one of the most meaningful spaces I have found in the world. And the thing that I would to learn and understand is that what's so neat about this, and I think this conversation is a wonderful example of it, is grief is one of the very few spaces that two emotions can live simultaneously, and that you don't have to pick a winner. And what I mean by that is, that we can talk about your dad, and there can still be incredible sadness attached to his death, and joy can live simultaneously to that when we think of all these wonderful things that that made him Chris Rock, right? Or not Chris Rock.
Kid Rock. Chris
Kid
Rock.
Rock. Yeah.
For those,
maybe a bit of a hybrid. Yeah.
I mean, almost the same.
Yeah, almost the same.
For those of you who've never seen a picture of my dad, he literally, I mean, he was like a doppelganger to Kid Rock.
Yeah. Oh man, it was one of the most incredible things in the world. And again, like reapplying that last sentiment of two emotions living simultaneously, right? Like, trying to think of other people that, have walked through loss, where, and I'll use my own grandma as an example. My grandma, for the last few years of her life, like ended up with dementia and Alzheimer's. So we experienced something called anticipatory grief, where we lost her over a period of time. And in those anticipatory grief settings, often what happens is we get ourselves to a place of preparing for loss. The thing that I've learned is even in those opportunities that you can prepare for loss doesn't mean that you're ready for it. Like it's still your grandma, it's still your mom, it's still your dad, whoever the relationship is. But the simultaneous emotion, again, I remember getting the call. And one of the unique parts about being a funeral director and living in rural communities, I ended up caring for 3 out of 4 of my grandparents. I remember going to the hospital when my grandma died. And I remember walking into the room. And I remember, like in that moment, kind of like just revisiting the experience of those last years of her dementia and her Alzheimer's. And like in so many ways, we had lost her completely before. And I remember seeing her, and I remember being sad, because it is sad to see people that we love after they've died. And also feeling completely relieved that part of her life was over. Those emotions are not just a part of the same environment, they're part of the exact same moment, and both hold equal weight as a part of that experience. Like, I don't have to pick which one I am. Am I relieved or am I sad? No, I'm both. I don't know if there's I have yet to find another setting outside of grief, outside of loss, that two emotions can live so close to one another and both be so validated.
I know you do a lot of work with families, of course. I mean, absolutely, funeral director. You're predominantly dealing with families through grief, but I also know that you talk about, like, you do conferences and you talk to people about helping others through grief when you're not related. And I think specifically, and through our podcast, we have a lot of entrepreneurs, we have a lot of leaders who listen, and they likely have some people in their lives that they're connected through work to that experience grief. How do you navigate, or how would you recommend that people navigate that conversation? Because it can certainly feel almost disingenuous when you say things like, I'm sorry for your loss. Like, it doesn't feel like you're doing enough. It feels like the canned statement. Like, what would you say people should do in those moments?
So first of all, like, the other part of this conversation, why I'm really happy to be in this environment today is I also really love business. I like educating. I like being in leadership roles. I like, I think a lot of parts about your podcast that I completely align with. And so the biggest thing that I would say for people in leadership roles is that the first thing we need to do is we need to better understand the definition of grief. And grief is our emotional and behavioral response to loss, not specifically to death. Okay. So the first thing that we need to recognize as leaders is how much opportunity we have to practice identifying and acknowledging grief in other settings, right? So thinking about, when we have coworkers that, and these are simple statistics, 40% of marriages in Canada end in divorce, right? So almost every second person we work with will, that has entered into a marriage is likely to have the experience of a divorce at some point in time in their life. Significant loss attached to when people get divorced, not just within that couple, but like the children that end up losing the loss of a relationship to a parent as a result of that, like changed relationship, like changed social networks, right? Like, I mean, I think of like the relationship I have with my wife. Most of our friends are a part of the same circle. Well, if we aren't together anymore, that fucks up some of those friendships, right? So, and again, I'm bringing this back together because I think these are really the opportunities we're going to have a much higher opportunity to start to better identify and acknowledge for the people that we work alongside. and seeing how, like one of the things that I say is where loss lives, grief will follow. So if you are walking through loss in any part of your life, like there's certainly going to be grief attached to that. And I think when we start to enter into those conversations with higher levels of emotional intelligence, introducing grief as a part of that experience, being able to better understand the different emotions attached to that. I think ultimately then, JP, what that does is that teaches us and it builds trust. It does a lot of different things. That when we enter into a period of grief, specifically when somebody dies, it becomes much more genuine. I'm not just all of a sudden trying to be emotionally intelligent because something very obvious has happened in your life. I've been paying attention along the way, communicating with you about that. And now when you walk through this very significant experience of grief, we're going to have a pre-existing relationship attached to this. That's going to make it much more comfortable and much more safe for me to be able to say, and I think it's extremely appropriate in that moment then to be able to say, I know words are going to fall short in this moment, but I just need you to know how sorry I was that your dad died or your mom died or you whoever. And I think the only thing I need you to hear from this conversation is, please, can you let me know what it looks like to be helpful to you? Don't assume what it looks like to be helpful. They probably don't need another frozen lasagna for their freezer. They probably don't need a 10th arrangement of flowers for their house, right? So what does it look like to be helpful to you? And I think the great big thing to do, again, just especially trying to specifically attach this to, say, those leadership type roles and especially in workplaces, things like that. I think asking for permission is extremely important when we want to walk alongside somebody during their loss. And that is just as simple as saying, is it okay if I send you a text in a few days just to check in with you? Are you all right if I give you a call? Do you know what I mean? Just very little intentional steps. And I think the biggest piece of advice that I would have for anybody that's trying to walk alongside someone else during their loss is it is very important for you to recognize you cannot fix this for them. We grew up in environments of wanting to fix people that are going through hard things, right? It's just, and the simple reality of this is there's no end game to grief. You're playing the long game. And it's again, what I love about the circle of these conversations is just literally rewind 30 minutes and hear the emotion in my voice talking to my friend about his dad that died. I will probably have that level of emotion when we talk about Kid Rock in certain environments for the rest of my life. And then I exponentially add on to that when I consider what it's actually like to be, you, his son, or your sisters, or, so it's just really important for us to not think that there's an end game to it and to be able to consciously re-enter that space of grief for as long as we're going to be in a relationship with these people, whether that's a working relationship, whether that's a personal relationship, and gaining that confidence again of saying their name and being intentional about making sure that if nobody else in their life, I am going to be the person that continues to create space for you to talk about this person.
It's time for a coffee break. If you want some delicious Master's Medium or Dojo Dark roast coffee, just send us a message for more info. While you're here, why not also take a moment to leave us a rating and review in your favorite podcast app or on our Facebook page? Every rating helps the show. Now, back to Seth and JP.
I think a good opportunity to throw in this week's question from Mama Seth, who you know very well. So her question this week was, Jeremy, living in a small town and doing the job that you do and sort of having to interact with these people on a day-to-day basis, how do you that are going through these things that you would have intimate knowledge of, how do you deal with that? And I think you've given us a bit of a taste of it, but I know Provost is not a big place.
No, it's not. It's literally half the size of Wainwright. So I mean, it is, to scale. So we live in a community of about 2,000 people. With the area that we serve, we probably serve a population of about 5,000 to 6,000 people. And again, just for the context of conversation, what that means is we usually serve 60 to 70 families a year. So getting right to it, I think the thing that I had to learn, and it like this took an incredible amount of time to be able to really learn how. But ultimately, for me, I look at it, in a lot of the same environments as other like caregiver roles in the community. Where I really look at as being a funeral director, being an embalmer. This is the way that we help take care of our community. Much like our nurses, much like our doctors, our first responders, our healthcare workers that are also working sometimes in extremely difficult environments. That again, this is how we're able, to help take care of our community. And really the mindset that I've got myself to a place with is, I look at it from, I guess, like, it's just, I look at the trust that every single family puts in us to take care of their loved one, regardless of circumstance. And the trust that they sometimes don't have a choice in, meaning there are families that absolutely call us because they've been told they have to call a funeral home. And now it's like, all of a sudden, this person that's extremely important to me is going to be taken care of by somebody that I may not even know. Right. And that's such a big deal to me. And so when I really get focused in on that is built between us, and then because trust is where the opportunity for a relationship becomes very relevant, right? When I acknowledge that trust, and I can, through the experience of walking through those funeral arrangements, sharing my knowledge with you about learning what your opportunities are and what it looks like to be helpful to you, helping you navigate those decisions. And then, through the entirety of that experience, we build very, very meaningful relationships with families in an incredibly short amount of time. I bet we get to know people sometimes better than some of their best friends do in less than 36 hours. Because here, like when you're sitting at the funeral arrangement table, you skip all the foreplay. Like, we're not going to sit here and talk about the weather. We're not going to sit here and talk about shit that doesn't matter. What we are going to do is we are going to talk about the most important person in the world to you at this exact moment. And we're going to talk about the most important things and the most important relationships attached to this person. Right. And so the smaller those circles get, so, going back to your mom's question about how do we do this in a small community? The reality is oftentimes when we sit at the table with these families, we already have a pre-existing relationship, whether it's just seeing each other around town. Like, it doesn't always mean we're close with everybody, but usually one another because it is a small community. So it just really grows the opportunity for building that trust, building that relationship, because you're going to see me at the grocery store at some point in time. And because of my personality, I'm not going to take the other aisle. Like, I'm going to meet you in that space. And if it gets emotional, I'm going to create that space for you to feel that. Like, that's okay with me. Right. And so I actually really love serving families in a small community through funeral service, because it's just led to such meaningful relationship and an incredible opportunity, to get to know people. And I mean, we have had some extremely difficult environments. Like we've had children pass away. We've had young people die. We've had older people die that were just, the pillars of their family. It's age doesn't dictate tragedy. And so it's sad. There are some very sad situations, and families that we've had to serve. But then, like, that is just one of the things that I'm extremely fortunate to be able to come home and have a partner, that just really creates the opportunity for me to talk about those days and, leans into those conversations with me. And I've got some really great friends that create safe places for me to have those conversations because, and I'm a huge advocate for mental health. Like, I see a psychologist on a somewhat regular basis, like I'm at minimum seeing a psychologist 3 to 4 times a year, even when I'm feeling really good, because I just like to have somewhere to check in with. Right. So I think there's a huge mental health aspect to that conversation, that anybody that is, I think you could apply it into any environment, But if you are going to intentionally enter into a relationship with people in your life, at some point in time, you're going to need to have somebody to talk to about it, right? And so, yeah, I'm a huge fan of professional help. I'm a huge fan of tight circles, close people, having safe places to have these conversations with. Because what I've learned, and it is something that I talk about, like when I do say like continuing education courses or workshops or things, I go through a process I call my order of service. And ultimately what it is, it's how I've learned to go inward before outward. If I want to show up as the fullest version of myself, to serve your family as a funeral director, what I've learned at a very high level, which came at a cost at one point in time, was that I have to take care of myself first. And what that looks like is number one, taking care of myself mentally and physically, honoring those relationships closest to me. So my nuclear family, which is my wife, Bailey, and our 3 kids, and then going through a few other things, which ultimately then that way, when I show up at work as a funeral director, I'm actually present. One of the things that used to get me really distracted was I would try to take care of too many people at once, and I would try to serve too many spaces at once. And so what happened is, say I would go to work and I would be very distracted by what was going on at home. So then I would get home and then I would be distracted by what was going on at work. So I was never actually present. And so, am I still on? Oh, sorry. It just said I got signed out. But yeah, so it just, it ultimately what it led me to is realizing is that, and that was a very defeating, very, very defeating feeling. And I think there's a lot of people listening to this would understand that, where you're working really hard in multiple spaces and feel like you're falling short everywhere you go. Right. And I think if you reverse engineer that happening, oftentimes what it is just a simple reality that you're trying to go outward too much and you forgot to take care of yourself first. And taking care of yourself again is a very intentional process of mental and physical things that we can do for ourselves, actually plotting out what are the most important relationships in your life, honoring those relationships in a way that allows you to show up in those professional spaces at the level that you desire to.
So what are some of the logistical or real life challenges you face working in a small town?
The mindset that you have to recognize, probably running a lot of businesses in small communities, and the more niche you get, again, just really needing to gain confidence in the reality that you're going to have not necessarily turnover with staff, but you're definitely going to have to be willing to train people over and over and over again, and so the thing that we had to do in our setting is what we basically is like, so we've owned the funeral home for 12 years now. And when I look back at some of the strategies we've taken with employees over the years, like we used to have one person, I had one full-time staff member and was just like super invested into this person, like spent about realistically about 5 years training them, getting them to like this level of where they were just really a wonderful addition to our team, to the and then, what ended up happening is that at some point in time, that person was no longer employable to the business, is probably the best way to word this. And ultimately where that left us was like back at the very start, meaning it was just like, so not just the cost of having this person on staff for those years, not just the cost of helping them through their school, not all of these things. In addition to that, it was just like this lost piece of time. Right. And I think that was the hardest part for me was it was just like extremely deflating, extremely defeating, to have feeling like I was starting over. And Bailey and I have talked about this often. Like we've owned this funeral home for 12 years, realistically feel like we've rebuilt the business a minimum of 5 times, because it's just like this cyclical experience of like something changes, something significant changes, and now you're back to the stage of like having to just reevaluate how to move forward with that that business, because the goal constantly being for growth. And I think it's important when I talk about growth, it's not specifically financial growth. A lot of that growth was, like quickly, but before we were sort of on air here, we just talked about really now investing into environments, wanting to create predictable outcomes for ourselves on personal levels. So some of that growth is, how do we attach a schedule to a very unpredictable work environment? How do we make sure that everybody knows that they're going to have their opportunity to stay home and be with their family on Christmas and not get called out, right? Like really trying to be mindful of those things. So I think when, for us and specifically talking about our business, the thing that we ended up having to decide to do in our setting was looked at realistically what our business requires is myself plus one other full-time position to run most effectively and which also gives people some space outside of work. But the best way of accomplishing that was actually to, instead of just hiring one position at 100%, what we actually ended up doing is we actually hired two positions at 60%. So running slightly inefficiently in a sense of, we have more staff than we need at times. But the reality is by introducing that other person, it also removed an incredible amount of pressure from the idea that like we just knew nobody would ever be in a position of having to do it by themselves, right? So as a business had to look at that as like an investment into realizing, if we're willing to run slightly inefficiently on the numbers game, I think macro, so micro, we're running inefficiently. Macro, I think we're money up, because now you're not spending so much time, like you don't hit that 5-year mark and end up having to start over, right? It's just like we are in a bit of a hybrid scenario, which is probably, again, like you have to realize these things aren't always going to happen this way, but the two staff that we have are growing their families, and it happens to be at the exact same time. So they're both going to be off for their parental leaves for the 12 months. And like that just has to be okay. I think like these are the things where it's just like, this doesn't mean what we built isn't working, like it just sometimes timing just doesn't work out the way that we would hope it would. And so like you can't allow everything to defeat you. You have to be able to pull yourself out from that. And again, I think it's really powerful for people in leadership roles. So whether these are the business owners or the managers or to be able to like look at that and say, you know what, no, this is working. This is exactly what we had hoped for, because when these people return to a work setting, we do still have access to them. And even if they need to reduce their workload by a certain amount, to accommodate their new family, we still have way more access to help than we did before we hired these positions, right? And so just really, I think the biggest thing that has helped me as an owner of a business in a rural community is just really focusing mindset onto, number one, being able to see beyond specifically financial growth and looking at new types of growth. And for me is the way that I explain this, I did a speaking engagement once and truly, I think this is the mindset I bring into business as a result of what I do. Like, from being surrounded by death and sitting at the table with families, hearing their stories, listening to what their lives looked like. I think the thing that I've realized outside of Bailey and our 3 kids, the things that I require for happiness are time, health, and money. And again, recognizing, people that are listening to this aren't going to see what I'm doing here, but like, just for the sake, using your imaginations, like imagine that as a triangle, right? And so at each point, so we have the top, we have time, health, money at each of the corners of this. And what I've learned and what's really unique about this lesson is that typically in life, we're offered 2 out of the 3 things at any given time. Meaning, I look back to 18 to 25 years old, had lots of time, had lots of health, never had fucking money to do anything. Right. And then it's just like, I'm 36 now, like getting to the stage of my life where it's like starting to accumulate money, still have my health, constantly feel like I'm fighting for time to do things. Right. And then I look at, say, my parents' generation, like the year that my mom retired, ended up getting breast cancer. And so her first 2 years of retirement, well, she had time and she had money, and then she didn't have the health to have experiences, right? And so what I've learned from this and applied personally and professionally is, when you have access to all three things at once, like those are the moments you need to like literally run towards the sun. You know what I mean? And what becomes very powerful about this is when you realize that doesn't necessarily mean having access to all three of those things for months at a time. Sometimes it's just like you wake up and you have enough money in the cup holder, and you have the day off and you have your health. And it's just like, I've got the opportunity to take my kids on a hike today. Right. And it's just so just looking at that as like these small intentional things. I have the affordability to hop in the car and take my family on an experience, and the health to do it. Like those are fucking once in a lifetime moments that I think we don't necessarily recognize in the moment. Right. And so when you start to live much more intentionally with that, then you realize, and because again, there are going to be seasons in life where you're back to only being able to access 2/3 of those things. And that's outside of our control. So then it's like, once you start to realize that, you stop losing yourself to the moments that you only have 2/3, because you realize it's just like, well, no, I don't have control of this. Like right now, I'm in a season of life that financially we can't afford to do these things. Or right now we're in a season of life that I don't have the time to do these things, or I don't have the health to do these things. And so I think it just really makes you appreciate those opportunities that you have access to all three.
One of the things I'm loving about this podcast, Jeremy, is I've had like 74 questions to ask you, but you just like keep rolling and you answer them without me having to ask. So that's been really efficient.
You've talked a few times now about personal development. I know we'll get to what you're doing for personal growth, but I'm curious because how many people know a lot about the industry that you're in?
Yeah.
If you're outside the industry, you probably know nothing. So has there been a lot of advancement and change in your industry and development industry wide?
Yeah, I think so. I think, we're actually, over the course of my career, entered a really unique time in funeral service. So funeral service used to be very male dominated, especially, 30, 40, 50 years ago. And so what has happened, and this really probably started in line with around the timing of me coming into funeral service, but, became more female driven, which I truly believe, I truly believe I'm a feminist. I think it's one of the best things that could have happened to our profession was to have a much higher level of female involvement. Like women are so well equipped. I think to run the world, to be honest, but, again, trying to focus in on my part of the world being funeral service. And I think the biggest advancement I'm seeing take place right now in funeral service is emotional intelligence. The people that are having the highest levels of success are the people that are able to recognize that, and this was something, again, like just relating this back to our own experience, our own story, is when we bought the funeral home from the Gregory family in 2009, they were top notch. It was a great business. Like this family had served the community for 50 years, and they had always done an extremely good job. Like their professional reputation was bar none. And so, when we moved in, we knew that. And for me, even at that age, I was only 24, but like even at that point in time was easily able for me to recognize that our opportunity to grow this business wasn't going to try to polish the professional side of it. It was going to be to, have a responsibility to maintain the professionalism, but our opportunity to grow the business was going to be on the personalization side, was by building relationships and in the way that we communicate about what we do. And so, I really believe in our profession. I really believe in a lot of what we're trying to work towards, that again, another event I did, I spoke once just at a Canadian College of Funeral Service graduation, and it's the school that I went to. I got invited back quite a few years later to just give a talk to the new graduates. And it's actually really funny because it was another situation of revisiting educators, people that taught me. And it was just like, I remember this Rick and Roger and Joe, having our Ryan Coke on the Thursday night before the graduation or whatever. And it's just like, I'll be honest, Jeremy, if we had to pick one of our previous students that would get invited back as a guest speaker, we're not really sure you were on the list. I was like, yeah, that makes perfect sense to me, but I remember like when I had the opportunity to speak to that group, because I'm extremely passionate about what I do. I love what I do. And I think we have an incredible opportunity to serve our communities, but there's also intentional choices you have to make within that. And one of the things you have to choose is, so are you going to be a funeral service provider, or are you going to be a disposition provider? And what I mean by that is, are you going to be somebody that just simply, takes care of the body for a family, or are you going to serve the entirety of that family? And I think those are completely different businesses. Provincially, they're going to be licensed the same way. They're all going to be called funeral homes. But the opportunity that we have to serve families really comes down to that simple fact: is simply going to be somebody that is responsible for taking care of the person that died, or are you going to take on the responsibility of taking care of the entirety of that family? And I think really what's happened is, and is continuing to happen within funeral service, the biggest progression I see. I mean, yeah, there's some technological advances being made. Like, we're making much nicer cards, where we have nicer websites. We have, like, there's a lot of things that have definitely advanced alongside all of this. But the biggest advancement we're making is that intelligence part of the conversation, where we're able to recognize that, outside of this person that died, we do have a high level of responsibility to not just take care of the spouse, but to take care of the entirety of that family, to engage with the grandchildren and engage with the great grandchildren, and make sure that they're acknowledged in their loss and have the opportunity to join their family in mourning as much as the mom or the dad or whoever does.
So Jeremy, tell us a little bit more about death education and what that's all about, how people can find out more information about some of the services you guys offer.
Sure. So death ed, very much short for death education, just like, and so death education, again, historically was known as thanatology. And ultimately, to simplify it, is for me, it's kind of the study of the human behavior attached to grief and loss. And the thing is thanatology was more specific to studying, the emotion of what happens when somebody dies. And for me, really just leaning hard into the idea that, again, grief is our emotional and behavioral response to loss, not specifically to death. So basically, where death ed started and how it began was just a deep recognition of these lessons that I've learned in my life from being in the trenches of loss with families in the immediate parts of their loss. I've learned have become extremely applicable into almost every environment. I actually think you would have a hard time coming up with an environment that I would not be able to reverse engineer it into. And so what ended up happening is again, because this is such a unique space to be able to talk to this about, that it is a combination of the emotional side of the conversation attached to the business side of the conversation. Is, traditionally the way that you grew a funeral home business was to try to do more funerals. You would buy another funeral home, you would open a new location, you would do these things. And the thing that we knew we didn't want to do was follow that footpath, meaning didn't want to buy a second location an hour away and feel like we were stretched more thinly and need more staff and do all these things. So this was actually our biggest opportunity to grow on a business level, was to figure out a way to grow the business without growing the funeral home part of the business. And what that meant was taking this knowledge that we've gained over this almost, almost 17 years of being in the funeral profession, and now reapplying it into new settings. And the way that I guess I learned how to do that was, I really believe this is a wonderful way to explain it. So in small communities, especially, I think it would be the same in a lot of urban centers, but in small communities for sure. So it's when it's fire prevention week, they take all the kids over to the fire hall and they talk to the firefighters. They see the trucks. They get some lessons on fire prevention. When it's community safety week, the RCMP come to the school and they talk to the kids about what's going to happen, and how to be safe in this and that. Or when it's something healthcare related, they go to the hospital and so it's basically these people are all resources to their community. And then somebody dies in the community or somebody dies in that school. and they bring in the 21-year-old FCSS worker that has never walked through loss personally in their life to try to help this mass of people, and can sometimes actually not be a resource at all because they just simply don't have the experience to back it up. And so I saw this happening, throughout the entirety of the early parts of my career, and it just never made sense to me. So when we moved to Provost, we quickly inserted ourselves as a community resource, saying we are here to walk alongside you, like as parents, as educators, as fellow professionals in this community, as a resource about grief and loss, because you know what, we are experts in that field. There's nobody else holds the knowledge that we hold, simply because of accessibility. Nobody else in the world has the accessibility to families in the immediate parts of their loss other than funeral directors, right? And so basically I just was informally, how this ties into your question, was informally doing death education for the entirety of my career. And then how that kind of grew into a business was by just formalizing that experience and saying, you know what, we do hold a lot of knowledge. We are a huge resource, and we can take this information, create something tangible with it that makes an actual teachable lesson that you can now take home and reapply, whether that's into your own family setting, whether that's into your own business. And so really Death Ed then became the space for it is a grief and loss education platform. It is the tangible way of taking all of this knowledge that we've gained from families trusting us to join them in their loss, listening to them, truly sitting at that table, listening to their experiences, and then bringing it back and kind of almost in a sense digesting that information and then bringing it out in a way that we can reapply it into new environments. How do we talk about how impactful this loss of let's look at, Seth, I don't know, JP, for you personally, but Seth, I know, for your kids, right? Just the lost sense of predictability in the midst of a pandemic, not knowing if you're going to school or not knowing if you're going to have access to your social networks, not knowing if you're going to, be able to see your family this month or this week or this year, right? There's an incredible amount of loss that. And the thing is now when we can start to recognize that as loss, and we go back to the idea that where loss lives, grief will follow. Well, if we are starting to see emotional and behavioral responses from our children in environments that we are not used to seeing emotional and behavioral responses from them, we can probably, again, rewind that behavior and be able to say, oh, maybe it's related to this experience that they're having of not being able to see their friends, or not being able to see their grandpas and grandmas, or not being able to access sports or whatever it is, these things that are likely really important to them. And so it was just really, ultimately what Death Ed is just trying to redefine what grief is, showing people how to identify where loss can live so that we can properly acknowledge one another in those spaces. One of my favorite quotes, maybe of all time, for sure right now at this stage of my life, is by Parker Palmer. And he says, "The human soul does not want to be advised or fixed or saved. It simply wants to be witnessed exactly as it is." And I think the whole driving force for me with Death Ed is to show people that in times of loss and in difficult times, our goal should not be to fix one another. Our goal should be to see one another. And I think grief is absolutely grief and empathy and acknowledgement are going to be the emotions and the tools that allow us to properly do that. And so, yeah, that was a very long-winded version of the question that you asked me, but just to give you more context up to what Death Ed is, it is not just simply death education about what happens when you die. Happy to talk about that as well, but it's just so much more meaningful than that for me, that there's much more than a functional part to it. And I think there's just an incredible amount of magic in this space, and there's so much learning that we have to do, because I think generationally speaking, we are literally just starting these conversations. This is not something our parents or our grandparents ever talked about out loud, for sure.
I know your website says that you do speaking engagements, you do corporate engagements, you do a little bit of everything. So what's the best way for folks to get in touch with you if they're looking for?
Yeah, so probably right through the website, there's a contact form. So the website is www.deathed.ca. And, navigate the website. It is pretty straightforward. We try to keep it as simple as possible. But there's just a contact form on there so that if anybody would like to connect, it comes right through to our email. And whether that's, and that connection isn't necessarily specifically for formal engagements. It is, if you have a question, like we want to be available as a resource. So I love getting emails from people asking specific questions about their own grief or about somebody that they're walking alongside, and just using us as a resource. Because JP, you mentioned this earlier, funeral professionals are not necessarily the most approachable profession, meaning and I think that's a historical thing, where it was almost like really secretive. Like, what the hell do those guys do? We know the surface level stuff. We know that they take care of people when they die, and we know these certain things really going on behind the scenes. And the thing is I don't think it needs to be a secret at all. I think this is another opportunity. We do have to educate our communities. So it just, if there's any kind of question, the website's just a wonderful way to reach out, whether it is curiosity about what we do professionally, or whether you're having maybe some hardship or looking for ways to support somebody that that's walking through loss. It's just a really wonderful way to connect with us.
Funeral directors, the only time people interact are when they've experienced some sort of loss in their life, or they're watching a horror movie, and the funeral director is always some sort of evil something in that horror movie.
Right.
So.
or that in filmography history where Jack Black was a funeral director, which may have been the most realistic portrayal of what we actually do. But yeah, it's not secretive, and it's funny. We go back to early in the conversation, you guys had asked, did you always want to be a funeral director growing up? And my answer was very clearly, absolutely not. What kind of kid would want to grow up and be a funeral director? I'll be honest, a huge driving force of mine, or passion of mine, is to change the narrative on that. I think it should be a really cool career choice for kids, and I think the way that we make that more achievable is by creating positive experiences. You can have a good death experience. As funny as that sounds, you can absolutely have a good experience when somebody you love dies. Now, again, you need to recognize we're not removing the emotion from that statement. My point is if we can truly walk alongside a family and show them, and educate them in what their opportunities are, and then support them through that experience by offering them our emotional intelligence and our knowledge and our professional support, I think it leads to very good experiences. And when the kids are sitting there watching that happen, when they see the opportunity that we have to create relationships with these families and the ways that we have to serve these families, and I believe that changes the entire trajectory of the child's life. Having a positive grief experience early in life and being acknowledged as a part of that process, I think it changes the entire trajectory of how those children will walk for the rest of their life. And
it's interesting. I didn't expect it to kind of go here, and I know we're getting towards the end, but that's kind of what we went through when our dog Grizzly passed away.
I remember Grizz.
He was a piece of work, but specifically what I went through with my dad, and that was really my first real exposure to death. And to your point, parents never really talked about death. Everyone kind of avoided the topic, and then you get hit with that, and it was a lot. So when Grizz was dying, I actually wanted the kids to experience it a little bit. And so we had a lady come to the house and do it. And we all sat there and bawled our eyes out, and it was hard, but I don't know. Some people disagreed with me, but I think Lyndon took a lot from that experience, and now he's experienced death, and we mourned it and we got through it. And I don't know what the right, half the time we're just kind of flying by the seat of our pants as parents, but I felt like in that moment, that was something that he should experience.
I completely support and am aligned with that approach. And do I understand? I think a lot of parents that are hesitant or wouldn't agree with that approach of just but they've likely never been shown how. Either they, it's very likely they haven't had their own personal experience with loss at that level. And nobody's ever shown them how. And so by including Lyndon and including your kids on that experience, ultimately what you're doing is you're giving them the opportunity to practice mourning and to practice grief and to practice empathy and to practice emotion. And that's extremely significant because, losing our pets is a really big deal. Actually, like for a lot of families, it's huge loss, and I can understand it. But the reality is for your kids, at some point in time, they are going to lose somebody much more important in their life. Right. So I live in a world of bad shit happening, meaning parents die young. Sometimes our kids die. Sometimes, their classmates die. And sometimes really hard things happen in kids' lives. And when we take the opportunity to include them in less traumatic environments that are still extremely emotional, like that gives them experience to lean back on. And why I think that is such an incredible favor to your children to have included them in that is they're going to remember that the next time they walk through any type of loss. And what they're going to be able to do is they're going to be able to say, I remember when this happened. And I remember, I don't remember exactly what everybody said, but I remember we were all together. I remember we were allowed to be open with our emotion. I remember we were allowed to ask questions. I remember this is something we talked about as a family, right? Like, it's just like, now what you've done is you've created this pattern for them, that says when hard things happen, we still allow for emotion. We still are going to talk about it. We are going to create space for it. And I'm not knocking previous generations or picking on anybody, but, in the past, typically what happened was it was just like something bad happened and nobody fucking talked about it, especially with the kids. Right? Because what we did, again, I recognize nobody's going to see us, but I'm making the shield, this body shield. And it's like, I'm going to put my kids behind me and I'm going to absorb as much of the emotion and as much of the pain from this as possible so that they don't have to take on any of it. And that is such a disservice because the goal should not be to remove the emotion. The goal should be to remove the fear. There was likely nothing scary about Grizzly dying because they were able to participate, because they were able to be present. If they just wake up one day and that dog is just gone from their life forever and nobody talks about it, imagine the fear that would be a part of that. Well, what happens at the end of life? I don't know. He just fucking disappear, apparently. Right? Like, and it's just like, and then we're leaving it then we're leaving it to them to tell themselves a story. Like, it's just like, go to your room and make up your own version of this story. And I just,
Grizz went to a farm and he lives there now.
Yeah. But, are you going to take me to a farm? Yeah. Like, what the hell? Like, like, it's just like, I just think there's, again, and I'm really aligned with that approach. I understand, like, not everybody's going to be, but I truly believe, I just really believe that is going to serve your kids at a very, very high level. Because, again, that is a significant experience of loss. Again, pet loss is a significant loss because we are very close with our pets. That they're just going to be able to transfer that experience without knowing it. Like, this will not be cognitive behavior. Like, it will just be subconscious behavior. But when they walk through other experiences of loss, they'll absolutely remember that, and it's why when Lyndon doesn't make the basketball team, he's going to be able to, like, talk to you about it. It's going to be okay if there's emotion attached to that experience. It's why, right? Like, I really believe those things are connected, Seth.
So I guess just on the way out of here, we always ask what you're working on for yourself. So what are you doing for yourself, for the podcast you're listening to? Is there anything you're working on right now for you? How are you feeding your mind?
Yeah. I'll be completely transparent. I'm in a bit of a lull right now. So I was happy to hop on this podcast because just like going through a season of life of truly not investing enough into myself. Like, the last couple of months have just been reasonably stagnant. Not reading, not listening to audiobooks, not listening to podcasts, just like living day to day kind of thing. And I think it's fine to have those seasons of life, but deep recognition, those are not the seasons of my life that I feel good. So I think I completely believe in vulnerability. I'm not going to sit here and say, oh, I'm doing this and this and this, and everything is just going like incredibly well right now. I wouldn't say it's like I'm not in a bad place. It's just in a season of not serving myself at a high level. And that shows. It shows in my health. Like, these are usually the times of my life. Like I get heartburn. I don't sleep well. Like all of these things that are not normally existent. So to well around that conversation though is the things that I do that I know provide me health. I have did we talk about the order of service at all? I'm trying to remember last time.
Yep.
Right. So like I just know I'm getting myself back to a place of it's like, number one, I need to book in with my psychologist. I need to do a session. I need to just unpack some of this last two months with him. And then I need to just lean into that order of service where I get very intentional about what does it look like to take care of myself? What does it look like to honor these relationships in my life? What does it look like to show up as a good boss? And like, so it just, I have the process and the tools that like quickly get me out of these experiences. But it's funny how that natural human behavior just for me allows me to slide in and out of it. It's funny how it's like, I know the equation to feeling good. And like sometimes how hard it is to stick with that stuff, right? Like it's a real mental battle.
I love that answer because it's very easy to come onto a podcast and just want to look good and sound like you've got your everything together and you're checking every box on the list. But I appreciate the vulnerability because certainly, I have times where things are going particularly well and I'm working out every day and I'm getting stuff done and feeling great. And then I have other times where, I'll go for 3, 4, 5, 6 weeks where I, barely left my house because I work out in my home now. So I've seen the grocery store and that's about it.
Yeah. And it's, like the last little thing I'll maybe throw in before we run out of time about I think vulnerability is the ultimate strength and transparency is a close second. Like none of us serve one another well by only talking about all the things that are going right in our life. And the simple matter of fact for me is the greatest levels of success that I've had usually started with some kind of failure, that like me becoming the husband and the father that I'm working to become was the result of being a shitty husband and father for a period of time. Right. It's like all of these things. And I think we need to be transparent in that you didn't just end up here. Like there was a process attached to it. And vulnerability for me, ultimately what I've learned is that when we're willing to be vulnerable in these conversations is vulnerability creates connection. And once we're connected, we can start to build trust. And once we build trust, we'll end up with a relationship. And if you and I can build a relationship, the meaningful parts really start to begin. Right. And so it's just like for me, it all starts with vulnerability. It all starts with being able to say, you know what, like if we want to get to this meaningful part of the conversation, then at some point in time, I'm going to have to be willing to open myself up to say like, this is who I am, or this is where I'm at, or this is my actual circumstance, not just what you've been seeing on Instagram.
Something that really resonated, basically the point you were getting to, or at least how I interpret it, is that we earn our values. And that's something that I heard recently on a podcast, Finding Mastery, with Dr. Michael Gervais. He's the sports psych for the Seattle Seahawks. And he just talked about like, in order to get a value, you have to earn it. You have to, like, to your point, you had to be a not so great husband to get that awareness and realize that. And I think if you kind of tap into the things that are important to you and what your values really are, there was likely a road to get there that wasn't all sunshine and rainbows. And I think it's a great point to maybe leave off on. And I think we could do a whole mini series just on this topic, but very cool.
Yeah, man. Well, I will definitely make a trip out and come check out the Biz Dojo studio at some point in time and maybe throw something else down onto the metaphorical tape or record or whatever this is.
JP has a big reel of tapes in his basement.
Yes, I have 4 reels. I splice them together by hand.
Awesome. Well, thanks again for having me, guys. I appreciate anybody that's willing to create space for grief to have a seat at the table.
Awesome. Thanks for coming in.
Thanks, Jer. Take care, man.
Right on.
Hey, thanks for listening.
Have you ever thought about how to unlock your own potential and what a coach could do for you? Well, reach out anytime. We'd love to set up a free discovery session with you to see if coaching's right for you and if we're the right coaches. Just send an email, coaching@thebizdojo.com.